Hey, here we are. We are back, and it is after the April break, which we didn't have anyway, and we're going to start World War II. And this is one of my favorite units, and come along for the ride here. I'm going to embed video clips into this, and I need you to watch this. I need you to process it, because before we get into the action, we have to talk about what was going on in the world during our 20s and 30s, where we talked about the United States. In other parts of the world, we're going to talk about the rise of the dictators. And a dictator is a person who gets control of an entire country. There's no democracy. And we'll talk about 4 specifically today. And when we get the stage set with these 4 dictators, we can get into why there was war and what happened. World War II is the big one. Okay, so we're going to start with what dictators do. What dictators do when they control the government is they have total control over everybody's lives. Elections, the government, the schools, all the courts, what you can and cannot do. They keep you isolated from the rest of the world by controlling the papers and the radio and the movies and stuff like that. An example of now is the North Korean leader and the North Korean dictatorship that we've talked about, how those people have nothing, for themselves and no rights at all. They also make sure nobody is going to take over their power. So they are really tough on anybody that has any opposition to what they're doing. Even if you talk about how bad they are or anything like that, they'll put you away. And these guys are brutal, and they're murderers, and we're going to talk about how they were very much involved in World War II. Okay, so we're going to start with 2 dictators that started up in the 1920s. Benito Mussolini from Italy. And he really kind of sets the model for being what's called a fascist dictator, to take over in all those ways I talked about. We'll also talk about the communist government in Russia that was trying to figure out what direction they were going, and a guy named Stalin, Joseph Stalin, took over, and we'll talk about Stalin. Then we'll get to, probably someone you have heard from a lot in history, Hitler and Germany, the Nazi Party, and how Hitler won elections but then took over the government and became a dictator in Germany. And then we're going to talk about a faraway place from Europe, Japan. And Japan's emperor was divine, sent from God, but a dictatorship led by military leader Hideki Tojo take over. And although the emperor is the supreme leader, it's the military in Japan that makes a lot of the decisions. So we'll go right here to Mussolini, and it's 1922, and I'll give you a little background on Mussolini in this video, and then we will get back to each other. So take a look here, and I'll be right back.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war, but his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold. Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?" "This army." Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator.
Okay, so that's just a little brief about Mussolini. I'll put some more links down there because, the more you know about these guys, the more it helps to understand why they do what they do. The next one we're going to talk about is a communist dictator, a little different form of government than Mussolini. Communism is where the state, the country owns everything. And the dictatorship in Russia was taken over by Joseph Stalin. Here's a little bit about Stalin and what he was all about. In many ways, Stalin is worse than Hitler. He really did have more people killed than Hitler. But we're going to talk about the tricky relationship because in World War II, we end up joining with Stalin to beat Hitler. It's complicated, okay? But we'll get to that. Here's a little quickie video on Joseph Stalin from Russia.
In terms of ruthlessness, bloodlust, Stalin remains one of the greatest villains of the 20th century.
Yosef Dukashvili was born on December 18, 1879. He later changed his name to Stalin, meaning man of steel.
Stalin had a very harsh childhood in terms of poverty, and he had a tough life as a young man and was very quickly attracted to radical movements and causes.
Between 1902 and 1913, Stalin was imprisoned 8 times by the Russian secret police.
Stalin's rise to power started after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Bolsheviks deposed the Tsar and created a communist society.
Lenin died in 1924, and there was a big struggle about the succession of Lenin. Stalin eventually took over in a very complex maneuver that really showed his master skills as a manipulator of men.
Under Stalin, Russia became the second largest industrial economy in the world. It was all planned economies, 5-year plans, and if you didn't play by his rules, you went off to a labor camp, or you were summarily executed in some fashion.
3 million kulaks died as a result of Stalin's policies in the early 1930s. Now, he did increase the amount of food that was being produced, but at what cost?
During what many historians term Stalin's reign of terror, no one was safe from his ambition. His forced industrialization led to countless millions of deaths, and the worst man-made famine in human history.
Okay, now for the big guy, Adolf Hitler. And in 1932, he officially became dictator of Germany. But we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to use Oversimplified, which is a really neat video clip, and I want you to watch the whole things later. I'll put them down at the bottom of the page. But Oversimplified shows a little bit about what Hitler did after World War I. Regular soldier guy, goes back to a Germany that's completely devastated, emotionally, physically, financially. They're in real peril, and they have their Great Depression well before we do. And Hitler rises to power based a lot on his ability to attract people to his message. He's very good at branding. In other words, coming up with logos to display his party. And you'll see the swastika flag, which became the official flag of Germany. And then a little bit about how this happened. He did it by winning elections and then taking over. So from Oversimplified, here's a little bit of Hitler's rise to power.
November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany. but the everyday Germans still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet." What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator.
And finally, the Empire of Japan. Japan was actually on our side in World War I, and because of the fact that they didn't feel they were treated as winners in World War I, they were sort of let out of all the peace talks and things like that on the side of the winners. They were bitter about it, and for the next 10 years after World War I ended, Japan militarized. They started to build navies and ships. And you'll see that they do some of the earliest conquering in World War II. It's not really even officially the start of the war, but Japan is a country with a large population on very small islands, and they need natural resources, they need more room for their people, and they're going to go right next door to China, a place called Manchuria, which is north of China. They already control Korea, and they're going to start expanding. And led by the military dictatorship, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, does bow to what the military wants to do. So the rising sun in the east, the Empire of Japan.
High-ranking military officers argued that the problems the nation faced were due to a lack of space and resources. With 65 million people crowded onto 4 tiny islands, officers insisted that Japan needed to expand their empire via conquest and colonization. From their bases in Korea, Japan hoped to expand into a section of China known as Manchuria, arguing that the region had everything that Japan needed. Manchuria offered land for farming, room to colonize, and a rich array of resources. In 1931, a bomb planted by Japanese soldiers destroyed a section of a Japanese-controlled railway in Manchuria. Japan presented it to the world as an unprovoked attack by the Chinese army, and Japanese troops flooded into Manchuria. Within a matter of months, Manchuria became a protectorate of Japan. Manchuria, roughly the size of Germany and France combined, became the prime source of iron, steel, and coal for Japan. After their success in Manchuria, military leaders increased their influence and control over Japanese society. They assassinated 2 prime ministers, arrested government officials, and imposed harsh censorship. They used the schools and the media to present propaganda on behalf of the new government. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper, capturing several major cities. China, the world's most populated country, seemed helpless to stop the Japanese advances. The League of Nations, aware of Japan's immense brutality in China, offered little support to Chinese requests for assistance. When the Japanese delegate to the League was asked to explain the actions of his nation, he called the French and British hypocrites, noting that their countries had been the first to acquire interest in China. Following this exchange, Japan walked out of the League of Nations. Meanwhile, Japan's stunning successes in China firmly established the military's influence over the emperor and his government.
Okay, so the stage is set. Learn a little bit about these guys. I'll put some more complete videos below, and I know some of you guys are interested in this, so watch the videos. Tomorrow, we're going to do something about the start of the war, and there'll be some questions, but the stuff that I'm giving you today is not throwaway. It's really kind of the foundation to how this all happens, and you become a really smart person if you know this stuff. So, go ahead and watch the rest of the videos. Make sure you finish your gym kit from yesterday. And if you have any questions for me about World War II, anything specific, let me know. I'm very interested in taking this in directions that you guys suggest as well. This is a huge topic. I am not happy that I got to do it from home, but I still think we can get a lot out of this. All right, well, it's good to see you guys again. A new week. We're somewhere in the middle of April. I don't even know what day it is, you know, but I don't know. Well, apparently, things are gonna get better in New York over the next couple of weeks. Okay. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Let's go!